Hi, this is Collin Weigel. Thank you for joining. I'll be talking about testing solutions in the field. So this is a look at a particular application of behavioral economics, trying to influence behavior change in a context of agriculture in the Midwest. So first I'd like to thank my colleagues from Johns Hopkins University, the Nature Conservancy, and Purdue University, as well as CBER, who all collaborated on this project. So what we'll be looking at is a particular application of behavioral economics. So an overview of what we'll be seeing is the motivation for this particular project, how we try to address the barriers to conservation. We'll look at the soil health program that we use as the mechanism to deliver our behavioral intervention. We'll look at our design and how we designed our program to try to learn what worked or what didn't. We'll look at what we were able to learn from it and see what's next, both for this particular context of rented agricultural lands, as well as hopefully conservation more generally and what it can gain from what we did here. So the motivation for this is that agricultural pollution is a global challenge, especially in developed countries. It's very difficult to regulate agricultural pollution, especially nutrient runoff. This being because farmers wield a lot of political power. So voluntary programs are often the way that governments like the USDA try to address nutrient pollution. But those voluntary programs are not meeting their goals. Maybe the best example of this is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. That dead zone is fed by the Mississippi River Basin. That's a big location for farming, as well as for the contributions to nutrient runoff. So that's actually where we'll be focused, is the Midwest, in particular Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois. What we'll look at here is a particular group that's underserved by most USDA programs today. These are non-operating landowners, so folks who own land but may not themselves operate it. NOLs are actually a majority of farmland owners in many key states like Iowa. About 60% of farmland in Iowa is operated by someone who doesn't own it. NOLs are often not well understood. We don't know a lot about them, and they're not targeted by USDA programs. But what we do know is that rented lands have a lower rate of conservation practices for things like cover crops, which are used to hold nutrients in place and prevent soil erosion and nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen from running into local water sources and downstream into the Gulf of Mexico. So we want to increase conservation on these rented lands, and to do that we'll look at the barriers. So NOLs have a particular set of barriers in addition to what farmers usually face. And NOLs usually have little input over ag practices. Not that they aren't able to ask their operator to do something, but rather that they tend not to. So the social norm is that NOLs have relatively little input. They just let their operator do as they want and trust their operator to take care of the land and do its best. USDA programs are considerably more difficult when the operator is not the owner. And one thing contributing to this is that most leases are oral and they're annual. So a farmland operator doesn't necessarily know that they'll be using this farmland again into the future. They have a one-year lease, and also it's an oral lease, so they're not able to go to USDA programs and easily show that they have control of the land, making it sometimes difficult to get USDA funding for conservation practices like cover crops, where they have to show control of the land. So what we do is an intervention that tries to address barriers to conservation, in particular for these NOLs in the Midwest. To identify those barriers, we conduct interviews as well as explore the literature from behavior and sociology. So three main components emerge. This is communication between the NOLs and their operators. Oftentimes there's very little communication and they're not sure how to get it started. Difficulty in writing a lease, especially leases that include provisions for conservation practices. And financial motivations. It may be that the standard economic argument applies, that people just aren't doing conservation because it doesn't pay off. So our aim here is to increase cover crop usage by addressing these barriers on rented lands in the Midwest.
So we do this through a soil health program. We contacted 36,000 NOLs in Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois. And in doing this, we decided to use an RCT designer, a randomized controlled trial, which allows us to randomly assign one treatment to a person versus another randomly chosen person who gets a different treatment, and see which treatments have the best return. So in this case, we sent out messages. Some of them said things like, "What is soil health?" Another message was promoting the financial benefits of soil health. And we found that we had a higher return rate, or people responding to us, when we just said, "What is soil health?" So that was an interesting way to try to learn something about the population and perhaps increase the response rate on future messaging. So once we had NOLs who had responded to us saying that they were interested in this soil health program, we then sent them packets trying to address those barriers to conservation I identified before. Again, communication between NOLs and operators, written leases, and the financial motivations. So here are images of what the packet looked like. Here's the outside of the packet. And on the inside, here what you see is that there are these local resources, as well as on the right-hand side, there's the cover crop lease insertion, which they were able to use to amend a lease to include cover crops, as well as a cover crop financial incentive, which offered them money for those for including a cover crop in their lease. So let's take a look at how we designed this. So to learn if what we did had any effect, we tried to design our experiment as an RCT, or a randomized controlled trial. So there were NOLs, and they had to qualify, so those who responded to us and had not recently used cover crops on their rented land. That was a total of 2,225 NOLs. Now, we'd like to compare NOLs who receive any of our packets to NOLs who don't receive a packet. But we can't do that, because the NOLs who respond to a packet or respond to a message inviting them to join a soil health program are different from NOLs who don't. So we don't want to compare NOLs who responded to NOLs who did not respond. That wouldn't be a fair comparison. NOLs who are interested in soil health are likely much more prone to adopt conservation practices like cover crops, whether or not we send them a packet. So here what we're looking for is to randomly assign one of 3 treatments to the 2,000 plus NOLs in our experiment. So the first treatment is simply information. So that includes information on conservation, a guide to communication between the NOL and the operator, as well as local resources like NRCS offices and university extension. The second treatment includes all of the information, as well as example lease language. So that it makes it much easier for them to write their own lease or use the language that we provide if they choose. The third treatment gets the information, the lease language, and an offer of $1,500 to include 40 acres of cover crops in a written lease. We came up with this number because it's similar to what USDA programs offer, and through interviews, we were told that this is a reasonable amount. Finally, what we do is, with that random assignment, we then try to measure and see which group has the highest adoption of cover crops. And we do this in 2 ways. One is through remote sensing, so that's using satellite images to detect cover crops on rented land. The second is through a survey. Here we had nearly a 50% response rate, which is quite good for a survey. And so we're looking there to see if NOLs report that they adopted cover crops due to our packet. So let's take a look at what we learned. Well, T2 and T3, those that had the behavioral intervention of the lease, as well as the financial incentive, were no different from those who just received information. In particular, only 1.5% of NOLs offered the financial incentive decided to take it. So is this a success? It is, but not a huge conservation success. So we have to think about success a little differently from just getting the outcome we hoped for. What we do get here is learning what works and what doesn't. And we apply the mantra of test, learn, adapt. So here we tried these packets. We learned that adding the behavioral intervention or the financial incentive did not have a huge influence on people's conservation adoption. So we need to try something new, adapt it, and test it again. Finally, we also demonstrated that a scholar-practitioner partnership was possible here. So we were able to get some folks to adopt cover crops on their rented land, so it is a success from that standpoint, and we're also learning what works and what doesn't. And importantly, we found that intentions are not enough. So when we compare what people actually did with respect to our financial offer, 1.5% took it. We compare that to the survey of those saying what they would have done if they were offered it. We find that 45% of survey respondents said that they would have taken the financial offer. So that's 30 times the amount. We would have had a very different interpretation of the outcome for this experiment if we had just gone off of intentions alone. So finally, what's next? So test, learn, adapt. We offered NOLs $5,000, so we increased the amount, and we found the take-up rate was only 5%. It's more than what we found previously, but not enough relative to what we were hoping to get. So it shows that financial incentives may be an important part of the conservation puzzle, but it's not enough on its own. What's next for conservation on rented lands? Trying different messengers, a longer program, technical assistance, new ways that may be able to involve NOLs to get involved in their conservation decisions. What about conservation more generally? Well, surveys and interviews are useful, but they're not enough on their own. We have to go beyond intentions and measure actions. We need to avoid selection, so use a comparison group. So NOLs who are interested in soil health need to be compared to similar NOLs. Finally, we have to be willing to accept when a program does not have an outstanding effect, report that, and again, test, learn, adapt. Try new things and hopefully make progress towards getting better conservation outcomes. Thank you.